The jogging shoes were still warm when they found her. In Millbrook Township, a place where the biggest crime was usually teenagers spray painting the water tower, this single detail would stay in people's minds for the next 22 years. Something about the scene at Copper Creek Bridge on that October morning in 1999 felt wrong from the start. But no one could imagine just how many mistakes were made in those first crucial hours. Sarah Hamilton had been gone less than 8 hours when Hunter Bill O'Brien came across her body lying in the tall grass beside the old wooden bridge. A mist was still floating above the creek. Autumn leaves covered the ground in bright gold and deep red, and what should have been a beautiful fall morning instead turned into the backdrop of Millbrook's first homicide in over 30 years. Sarah was just 26 years old. She worked as a kindergarten teacher and had moved to Millbrook only 2 years earlier, leaving behind what she called the chaos of Detroit. She lived alone in a small rented home on Pine Street, just 3 blocks away from the elementary school where her students loved her for her patience and creativity. Twice a week, every Tuesday and Thursday evening, she laced up her Nike running shoes and followed the same 5-mile loop on the country roads outside town. Her route took her past cornfields ready for harvest, broken down barns, and finally onto the gravel path leading to Copper Creek Bridge. On October 19, 1999, Sarah's day began like all the others. She taught her 23 kindergartners a lesson about pumpkins, stayed after class to grade some papers, and then drove home in her red Honda Civic as the sun dipped below the horizon. Her neighbor, Mrs. Patricia Mendez, saw her arrive around 5:30 p.m. and waved from her porch. At exactly 6:15 p.m., Sarah left for her evening run. She wore her usual outfit: black running tights, a bright yellow windbreaker, and shoes with reflective strips. It was chilly, but Sarah had jogged through much colder weather before. The first sign that something was wrong came the next morning when Sarah didn't show up to work. Principal Robert Fisher tried calling her house 3 times, then finally drove over. Her car was parked in the driveway, the front door was unlocked, and inside everything looked normal. Too normal. Her school bag was still sitting on the counter, lesson plans scattered beside it, as if she had been interrupted mid-preparation. Even the coffee maker had been set for 6 a.m., but the pot was empty. Meanwhile, Bill O'Brien was out hunting along Copper Creek. He had walked those woods for 15 years and knew every trail and fallen tree by heart. When he spotted a flash of yellow fabric near the bridge, he thought someone had dumped trash. As he got closer, he saw it wasn't trash. It was Sarah's jacket. She was lying on her side in a shallow dip near the creek, partially hidden by a few saplings. The way she was placed looked deliberate, almost like someone had tried to hide her but hadn't gone through with it. From a distance, she didn't look injured. Her shoes were tied, her house key still pinned to her pocket, her hands clean. For a brief second, O'Brien thought she might have collapsed during her run. But when he called her name and got no answer, he realized it was far worse. Sheriff Daniel Walsh received the call at 7 a.m. He was 58 years old, planning retirement, and had never handled anything close to this. His career up to this point had been filled with traffic tickets, loud neighbor complaints, and the occasional case of drunk teenagers. The biggest crime in Millbrook until then had been a streak of mailbox smashing in 1997, done by a 12-year-old with a baseball bat. Murder was supposed to happen in the cities, not in a place where everyone still left their doors unlocked. Walsh arrived at Copper Creek Bridge with his 2 deputies, Mike Torres and Jennifer Quinn. The moment he saw the scene, he knew they were in over their heads. They didn't even have a crime scene photographer. Torres had to use his personal camera. Their evidence supplies were little more than gloves and plastic bags. The nearest medical examiner was 60 miles away in Grand Rapids, and the state crime lab had a long backlog from Detroit cases. Sarah's body gave hints, but none of them had the training to read those hints properly. She had no obvious wounds, no defensive injuries, no signs of sexual assault. Her jacket was zipped up, her ponytail still neat, her digital watch still running. The only visible mark was a small bruise on her left temple, about the size of a quarter. It could have been a fall, or it could have been a blow. The local doctor, Martin Hoffman, acting as coroner, estimated she had died 6 to 8 hours earlier. but nothing at the scene fit together. If she had been attacked, why was there no struggle on the gravel path? No scuff marks, no scattered rocks, nothing disturbed. Her jogging schedule was predictable, making her an easy target, but at the same time the bridge was remote and hidden, far away from anyone who might have seen what happened. Then Deputy Quinn noticed something unusual. Sarah's shoes, stuck. In the treads were tiny fragments of reddish clay, unlike the soil at Copper Creek. This clay was bright orange, not found in the area around the bridge. That meant Sarah had been somewhere else before her body ended up there. But where? Investigators began asking around. At the gas station, Carlos Rivera remembered a woman in a yellow jacket jogging past around 6:45 p.m., though he was too busy to notice much else. A farmer, William Carvalho, said he heard a car engine after 7 p.m. near his fields about a mile from the bridge, but he couldn't see the road. These scraps of memory were all the sheriff had to work with. As word spread, fear settled over Millbrook. Parents started driving kids to school. Joggers gave up their evening runs. The hardware store sold out of deadbolts within 3 days. Everyone had a theory, but no one had proof, and proof was what Sheriff Walsh desperately needed. Tommy's fingerprints were never found on Sarah's clothes or running gear. When the state crime lab examined his shoes, there was no trace of the distinctive reddish clay that had been stuck to Sarah's running shoes. A search of his small garage apartment turned up nothing suspicious, just empty beer bottles and stacks of unpaid bills. The most damaging piece against him was that his blood type didn't match a tiny sample taken from under Sarah's fingernail. Unfortunately, that sample was too degraded for advanced testing with the technology available in 1999. Deputy Jennifer Quinn couldn't shake her private doubts about Tommy's guilt. The community and her colleagues were eager to pin the case on him, but something about the evidence just didn't fit. During an interview with Tommy's occasional employer, construction contractor Pete Santoro, Quinn learned that Tommy had worked a demolition job in Kalamazoo the week before Sarah's death. The site foreman confirmed that Tommy had access to company vehicles during that time, including a pickup truck that was later returned with unusual wear on the tires and heavy mud caked in the wheel wells. But when Quinn tried to connect those details to the timeline of Sarah's murder, everything grew frustratingly vague. As the weeks turned into months, the investigation into Tommy Rodriguez drained the sheriff's department's already limited resources. Every lead produced less than the last. The state police offered help, but their procedures required paperwork and coordination that Sheriff Walsh's small-town team wasn't prepared to handle smoothly. Meanwhile, evidence sat waiting for lab results. Witnesses' memories grew fuzzier, and the community's fear slowly turned into impatience. People wanted an arrest, something to restore their sense of safety. Detective Patricia Moore arrived in Millbrook 18 months after Sarah Hamilton's death. She had been assigned by the state police to review cold cases in rural Michigan. Moore was 34, methodical by nature, and had spent 5 years working homicide in Detroit before requesting a transfer to quieter posts. What she found in Sarah's case file was a classic example of how limited resources and good intentions could derail an investigation before it ever really had a chance. The evidence room at the Millbrook Township building was more like a storage closet than a proper forensic facility. Cardboard boxes labeled with Sarah's name held items that had been collected but never processed correctly. Soil samples had dried out and cracked. Photographs were faded from poor storage. Witness statements raised more questions than they answered. Moore spent her first week just creating an organized inventory, and what she discovered made clear how many critical steps had been skipped or handled poorly in those first months. She began her reinvestigation with the reddish clay on Sarah's running shoes. The sample had been noted, but no one had really followed up. Moore arranged for a geological analysis, which revealed that the clay contained iron oxide, matching deposits near old mining areas. The closest site was about 15 miles northeast of Millbrook, where copper mining had ended back in the 1940s. The soil there was distinctive, but when Moore visited, she found no link to Sarah or any clear reason for her to have been there. By Then Tommy Rodriguez had been questioned on and off for 6 months. Eventually, his status shifted from prime suspect to person of interest to someone investigators simply couldn't eliminate or confirm. By the time Moore took over the case, Tommy had left Millbrook entirely, without leaving an address or any clue where he might have gone. Following up on him turned into another dead end. The Hamilton family's relationship with investigators had worsened over time. At first, Sarah's parents, Margaret and Robert Hamilton, drove from their home in Ann Arbor every few weeks to meet with Sheriff Walsh, pressing for updates. But those meetings became increasingly disappointing. Margaret, a retired librarian, had a sharp eye for detail and organization. In the beginning, her skills made her a helpful partner in the investigation, but soon she became what some officers quietly described as a difficult obstacle. Margaret built her own case file. She created detailed timelines, maps, and gathered every document she could through persistence and official requests. She reached out to forensic experts, retired police officers, and private investigators across the country. The advice she got often contradicted the work being done in Millbrook. As the months passed, her theories grew more elaborate, shaped by true crime books, TV shows, and online forums that promised solutions where professionals had failed. Detective Moore respected Margaret's dedication, even as it put her in a difficult spot. Some of Margaret's independent research had uncovered things the official investigation missed. For example, Sarah had received several hang-up calls in the weeks before her death, but no one ever traced or investigated them. A convenience. Store security camera had even captured a vehicle similar to the one seen near Sarah's jogging route, but the tape had been erased before anyone saved it. These oversights weren't about laziness or incompetence. They came from inexperience. Small-town officers were suddenly faced with a crime that looked more like something from the city. Moore spent 2 years combing through evidence, interviewing witnesses and chasing leads, but nothing held up. Eventually, she accepted a promotion to Grand Rapids, where the caseload offered more promise. Her final report on Sarah's case admitted that there were still promising avenues to explore, but the evidence just wasn't strong enough to charge anyone. The case was officially labeled cold. Still, Moore kept personal copies of some key documents and made Margaret Hamilton a quiet promise that she would keep thinking about Sarah's murder, even if she couldn't actively work the case. Margaret, meanwhile, refused to stop. In her 30-year career as a research librarian at the University of Michigan, she had built a reputation for finding answers others couldn't. Now, those same skills became both her strength and her torment. The Hamiltons' dining room table in Ann Arbor transformed into her command center, covered with folders, police reports, maps, and letters to and from investigators and forensic experts. Every possible lead received her full attention. Every theory, no matter how far-fetched, was researched and documented with the precision she once used to track obscure historical records. In 2003, 4 years after Sarah's murder, Margaret hired private investigator Daniel Murphy, a former Detroit detective who specialized in cold cases. His 6-month investigation cost the Hamiltons $12,000 and ended with the same conclusion as before. There wasn't enough evidence to name Sarah's killer. But Murphy's report also validated Margaret's instincts, that key details had been overlooked at the start. That was enough to keep her going. By the early 2000s, the internet opened new doors for Margaret. She learned how to navigate online databases, joined unsolved crime forums, and connected with families of other victims across the country. She used her growing computer skills to pull newspaper archives, court records, and police files that had once been unreachable. She built spreadsheets tracking similar crimes in surrounding counties, looking for patterns that might connect to Sarah's death. Her relationship with local law enforcement grew strained. She frequently mailed packets of research to Sheriff Walsh and his successors, containing new forensic techniques, case comparisons, and suggestions. Her tone was always polite, but the implication was clear. The original investigation had failed. By 2002, when Detective Moore left, Margaret lost the only ally she had inside the system. From then on, she worked almost entirely alone. The toll was heavy. Her marriage to Robert survived, but it weakened under the weight of her obsession. Friends drifted away, family gatherings grew uncomfortable, and conversations inevitably circled back to Sarah's case. Margaret had become more than a grieving mother. She was consumed, her life reshaped around a relentless pursuit of answers. In 2009, 10 years after Sarah's death, Margaret reached out to Dr. Jennifer Costa, a forensic genealogist who was gaining attention for solving cold cases by combining DNA testing with family tree research. Dr. Costa was intrigued, especially by the tiny DNA sample recovered from under Sarah's fingernail. That sample had never matched anything in traditional databases. Costa explained that technology wasn't ready yet, but in time, advancements might allow scientists to build a stronger profile. For Margaret, this partnership became a lifeline. Costa's technical expertise paired perfectly with Margaret's research skills, and for the first time in years, she felt she was working with someone who shared her determination. They discussed the case regularly, explored new possibilities, and waited for technology to catch up. Over the next 20 years, Sarah's evidence boxes were moved 3 times, first from the Millbrook basement to a county facility, then finally to a climate-controlled warehouse as part of an upgrade to Michigan's cold case storage system. By 2019, the Michigan State Police had launched a statewide program to revisit unsolved murders using advanced DNA methods that didn't exist in 1999. By then, Dr. Jennifer Costa had been working with agencies across the Midwest for 5 years. When Sarah Hamilton's case landed on her desk, she was determined to try again. The sample in question was no bigger than a grain of rice, extracted from cells found under Sarah's left ring fingernail. It had degraded over time, but now, with modern science, it just might be enough to change everything. For years, all investigators could say with certainty was that the DNA under Sarah Hamilton's fingernail belonged to a man, and it wasn't Sarah's own. That piece of information helped rule out some suspects, but it didn't give them anyone to positively identify. By 2019, however, forensic science had been completely transformed. New techniques for pulling information out of the tiniest and most damaged samples, methods developed in part for terrorism cases and identifying military casualties, had become standard in modern labs. Things that were impossible in 1999 were now routine. When the Michigan State Police Forensic Laboratory in Grand Rapids retested the tiny sample from Sarah's fingernail, the results were promising. This time, they were able to build a partial DNA profile, enough markers to potentially match someone if that individual's DNA was in a database. The profile was quickly compared against CODIS, the FBI's nationwide combined DNA index system, which stores profiles from convicted criminals, arrestees, and evidence from other unsolved crimes. The search came back empty. It was disappointing, but not surprising. Many offenders had never been arrested in the modern era of DNA collection. Dr. Jennifer Costa, however, had another approach. In recent years, a brand new tool called Genealogy had begun solving cold cases once thought unsolvable. Instead of relying only on criminal databases, this method used public DNA databases filled with profiles that ordinary people had submitted while researching their family history. Through companies like 23andMe and Ancestry DNA, millions of people had uploaded their genetic information, and those family connections created an entirely new way to identify suspects. Costa uploaded Sarah's partial profile to GEDmatch, a public site that allows law enforcement searches. The initial results brought back hundreds of potential relatives, ranging from close family to distant cousins, several generations removed. Each one had to be carefully researched. Costa began the painstaking process of building family trees, tracing lineages back through census records, birth certificates, marriage licenses, and obituaries. The work was slow and exhausting, but it was also the only way to narrow down the search. In March 2019, after months of digging, Costa found her breakthrough. One strong genetic match led her to a family line that included several men who had lived and worked in the Great Lakes region during the late 1990s. One name immediately stood out: Kevin Fraser, a 47-year-old insurance adjuster from Cleveland, Ohio. At the time of Sarah's murder in 1999, his job had required extensive travel throughout the Midwest. On paper, Kevin looked like the last person anyone would expect. He had no criminal record, a stable job, a long marriage, and 2 kids. He was active in his church, coached youth soccer, and lived a quiet suburban life. But he also fit the profile of someone who had both the opportunity and proximity to cross paths with Sarah. The real challenge was that Costa's critical lead came from an extremely distant connection, so distant that most genealogists would have dismissed it. The unknown suspect shared a great-great-great-grandmother with someone in the public database, meaning Costa had to trace family lines back to the early 1800s. Working from her home office in Ann Arbor, Costa turned her spare bedroom into a war room. 3 walls were covered with whiteboards filled with sprawling family trees, stretching across generations like giant maps of human history. Each potential suspect was color-coded, making the investigation look more like a visual puzzle than a police case. The genetic trail led her to the Morrison family, Scottish immigrants who had settled in Ohio during the 1840s. Their descendants spread across Michigan, Indiana, and the rest of the Midwest over the next century. After weeks of research, Costa uncovered a key detail. In 1923, family patriarch James Morrison had legally changed his family's surname to Fraser after inheriting his wife's manufacturing business. That single name change had created a genealogical blind spot. Traditional surname-based searches would never have revealed the Morrison-Fraser link until Costa pieced it together. This discovery narrowed the suspects to 3 men. Robert Fraser, a retired auto worker living in Detroit. Michael Fraser, a construction supervisor from Grand Rapids. Kevin Fraser, the Cleveland-based insurance adjuster. Robert was ruled out almost immediately. Hospital records showed he had been recovering from surgery in October 1999. Michael had verifiable employment, records placing him in Florida during that same period, but Kevin was different. His work as an insurance adjuster for Midwest Mutual required constant travel through Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, and Wisconsin. His job was flexible, often unsupervised, and took him to rural towns where he interviewed witnesses, photographed accident sites, and handled claims. That mobility made it nearly impossible to pin down his exact whereabouts on any given day. Digging deeper, Costa found that Kevin's life looked nearly flawless. Married to Linda for 18 years, 2 teenage children, a modest home in Lakewood, Ohio. His neighbors described him as helpful and polite, the kind of man who shoveled driveways for elderly neighbors without being asked. His record was spotless, save for a single speeding ticket in 1997. But then came the key detail. Kevin's work record showed that in October 1999, the very week Sarah Hamilton was killed, he had been assigned 3 claims in southern Michigan: a barn fire near Kalamazoo, a multi-vehicle accident near Battle Creek, and a slip-and-fall case at a grocery store in Millbrook. That last one stopped Costa cold. The dispatch records placed Kevin in Millbrook on October 19, 1999, scheduled to begin interviews at 7 p.m. Sarah had gone out for her jog at 6:15 p.m. and never returned. By June 2019, investigators launched a quiet surveillance operation on Kevin Fraser. The assignment went to Detective Lisa Rodriguez of the Cleveland Police Department, working alongside the Michigan State Police. Rodriguez had years of undercover experience and knew the balance required when investigating suspects who had lived respectable lives for decades but might be hiding dark secrets. Kevin's daily routine was painfully ordinary. He left his house in Lakewood at 7 a.m. each morning, drove his silver Honda Accord to his downtown Cleveland office, ate lunch alone at the same deli every day, and returned home by 6:15 p.m., unless he had evening appointments for work. 2. Prove or disprove his connection, investigators needed his DNA. But it had to be collected without his knowledge. For 3 weeks, Rodriguez followed him, waiting for the right chance to grab something he discarded. The break finally came at a Starbucks, where Kevin left behind a coffee cup he had been sipping for over an hour. The cup went straight to the lab. The 6 days that followed were tense. Costa continued her genealogical mapping while Rodriguez kept her distant watch on Kevin. Then, the results came in. The DNA from Kevin Fraser's coffee cup was a perfect match to the genetic material found under Sarah Hamilton's fingernail in 1999. In that moment, the suburban insurance adjuster who coached soccer and volunteered at church was no longer just a name on a family tree. He was the prime suspect in Sarah Hamilton's murder, a reality that forced investigators to face how easily a single act of violence can hide in plain sight for 20 years. The DNA match tied Kevin Fraser directly to the brutal murder of a kindergarten teacher in a town he claimed he'd only ever visited once, for a routine insurance investigation that lasted less than 2 hours. This revelation shook every long-standing belief investigators had about violence and about the hidden nature of killers who blend into ordinary life. As surveillance on Fraser expanded, small details about his personality began to take on darker meaning. Neighbors described him as intensely private, a man who was polite and friendly enough but never allowed relationships to develop beyond the surface. His wife Linda later admitted that Kevin had always been vague about his work travel, offering the bare minimum of details about where he was going or what he was doing on the road. She had assumed this was professional discretion, never realizing it was deliberate concealment. A closer look at his company's records from October 1999 exposed troubling discrepancies that had gone unnoticed for 20 years. Fraser had billed 4 hours of overtime for the Millbrook slip and fall case, claiming to have worked until 11 p.m. on October 19th. But the grocery store owner he was supposed to interview had closed at 6 p.m. that night, and had told investigators back in 1999 that no insurance adjuster ever contacted him about the claim. Fraser had submitted a detailed report, complete with supposed interviews and site notes, but in reality, the investigation had never taken place. Hotel records showed that Fraser checked into a Kalamazoo motel on October 18th and did not check out until October 20th. That gave him 2 full days in the region with no confirmed whereabouts. The motel clerk from that era had long since passed away, and any surveillance footage from 1999 had been erased decades earlier. His expense reports listed gas and meal purchases across southern Michigan, but the receipts were too old to verify, and most of the businesses had changed owners multiple times. The psychological picture that emerged was of a man who had carefully divided his life into compartments. Outwardly, he was steady, dependable, and ordinary. Inside, he concealed impulses and behaviors his family and co-workers never suspected. Ironically, the very qualities praised in his job, independence, attention to detail, and reliability, had made him both a trusted employee and someone with the perfect cover to hide activities that had nothing to do with insurance claims. Detective A. Lisa Rodriguez, who led the final surveillance effort, noted that Fraser seemed increasingly stressed as time passed. He never showed signs that he knew he was being watched, but subtle changes in his routine stood out. He began taking longer lunches, often wandering alone through downtown Cleveland parks with what Rodriguez described as a haunted expression. His conversations with colleagues became shorter and less personal. Linda mentioned to a neighbor that Kevin had seemed distracted lately and was having trouble sleeping. The arrest came on a Wednesday morning at 6:47 a.m. Fraser was loading his briefcase into his Honda Accord in the driveway of his Lakewood home when police surrounded him. Rodriguez had timed the arrest carefully so his teenage children would already be at school, sparing them the trauma. But there was no way to protect Linda from watching her husband of 21 years handcuffed and led away by officers reading him his rights in voices that carried across the quiet neighborhood like a public sentence. Fraser's reaction unsettled even the most experienced detectives. Instead of panicking or denying everything, he listened carefully to the charges against him, asking measured, almost professional questions about the evidence and the legal process, like he was reviewing an insurance file. The lack of visible emotion felt jarring, considering he was facing life in prison. It wasn't until the interrogation room door closed behind him that the mask finally began to break. The confession did not come quickly. Over 3 days of questioning, Fraser gave fragments, each one more disturbing than the last. At first, he flatly denied ever hearing of Sarah Hamilton and claimed he had no memory of being in Millbrook on October 19, 1999. When confronted with the DNA evidence, he insisted it must have been contaminated, or that he might have brushed past Sarah unknowingly somewhere in Michigan. But when investigators produced the insurance records that proved his reports were falsified, his story collapsed. The truth was worse than anyone had expected. Fraser admitted that he had fabricated the slip-and-fall case as a cover, giving himself extra time in the Millbrook area. He said he had been drawn there by what he described as an inexplicable urge to experience the isolation and emptiness of rural Michigan roads. On the evening of October 19th, while driving aimlessly, he saw Sarah Hamilton jogging alone near Copper Creek Bridge. According to his confession, what followed was not premeditated, but a crime of opportunity. He pulled over, approached Sarah under the pretense of asking for directions, and when she tried to continue running, he grabbed her arm. A brief struggle followed. Sarah fell, striking her head on a rock near the creek bank. Fraser claimed he only intended to force her into his car, but her resistance and the isolation of the area escalated the situation. His account was chilling not because of its brutality, but because of the way he delivered it. Calm, clinical, and in the same measured tone he once used to describe property damage claims. He explained how he had moved Sarah's body to the spot where it was later found, cleaned the immediate area of obvious evidence, and tossed the bloodied rock into the creek where it would never be recovered. He changed clothes back at his motel, burned the ones he had worn, and falsified his paperwork to back up his cover story. Most disturbing of all, within hours of the murder, Kevin called his wife from his motel room to discuss their children's school activities. His voice, Linda later recalled, carried no trace of what he had just done. A psychological evaluation conducted during the confession painted a complex portrait. Dr. Patricia Hoffman, a forensic psychiatrist, observed that Fraser did show signs of genuine remorse for Sarah's death, but at the same time he expressed a strange pride in having avoided detection for 20 years. She concluded that this contradiction pointed to a deep personality disorder. He could function normally in society while harboring impulses that most people could never imagine acting on. News of Fraser's arrest hit both Lakewood and Millbrook hard. In Lakewood, neighbors struggled to reconcile the image of the kind man who shoveled their driveways with the killer, who described Sarah Hamilton's murder in cold, emotionless detail. In Millbrook, people faced the reality that the case that had haunted them for decades had been solved, but only because Sarah's killer had finally been unmasked after hiding in plain sight. The sentencing hearing in Allegan County drew a packed courtroom. It felt less like a legal proceeding and more like the release of 22 years of built-up grief. Margaret Hamilton sat in the front row behind the prosecution table, flanked by her husband Robert and her surviving son Michael. At 73, she looked smaller and frailer than she had in her years of relentless searching, but her eyes carried the determination of a mother who had waited more than 2 decades for justice. Detective Patricia Moore, now leading the cold case unit in Grand Rapids, returned to Millbrook to testify. Her presence was symbolic. She had been one of the first investigators assigned to Sarah's case, only to be forced to walk away when technology and resources failed. Now she told the court how the advances in DNA analysis and genealogy had finally made it possible to bring the truth to light. The victim impact statements made clear that Sarah's death had scarred the community in ways no one fully recognized at the time. Parents had restricted their children's freedom. Evening joggers abandoned their routines. A sense of safety and innocence had never returned. Robert Fisher, the now retired principal of Sarah's school, described how her classroom had always felt incomplete, how former students still asked about the teacher who loved them, and then vanished. For the Hamiltons, the emotional toll was laid bare. Robert Hamilton spoke softly, his voice weakened by age and grief, about the agony of 22 years wondering if his daughter's killer was someone he passed in grocery stores or gas stations. Michael Hamilton described what it was like to grow up in the shadow of his sister's unsolved murder, and to watch his mother transform from a grieving parent into a relentless investigator whose life was consumed by the search for answers. Then Margaret spoke. Her statement was the culmination of everything she had carried since the day Sarah died. She did not speak of revenge. Instead, she described the exhaustion of living with unanswered questions for 22 years. She thanked Dr. Costa and the investigators, who had finally given her family the truth. And she expressed her hope that their work would help other families who, like hers, had lived for decades without closure. Kevin Fraser's sentencing brought an end to a case that had haunted 2 states for more than 2 decades. In court, Fraser kept his statement short and carefully prepared. He expressed regret for Sarah Hamilton's death and admitted the pain his actions had caused to her family and others. He didn't try to justify what he had done, nor did he make excuses. His attorney asked the judge to consider Fraser's cooperation with investigators and the fact that he had no previous criminal record. But the request for mercy was met with silence from a courtroom full of people who had waited so many years to see justice finally served. Judge William Thompson spoke at length before delivering his decision. He reminded everyone that this case stretched across eras, covering 22 years of freedom for Fraser while Sarah's loved ones were left with decades of unanswered questions. He explained how the investigation had carried the justice system from the early days of basic evidence collection all the way to the advanced DNA techniques that ultimately solved the case. According to the judge, those 22 years were more than just stolen time for Fraser. They were years of stolen peace for an entire community, and years of pain and uncertainty for the Hamilton family. The judge then sentenced Kevin Fraser to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the Hamilton family, the verdict meant the legal battle was finally over. But emotionally, the healing would take much longer. After the hearing, Sarah's mother, Margaret Hamilton, stopped to speak with Dr. Costa and Detective Moore. These 3 women had been bound together by their determination to keep searching for the truth, no matter how difficult the road became. Sarah Hamilton's case is now remembered not just as a tragedy, but as an example of how modern forensic science can bring answers to long unsolved crimes. It stands as a message of hope for families still waiting, while also showing how much patience and persistence are required to achieve justice in an imperfect system. If you've been following this story, we'd love to know your thoughts. Do you believe advances in forensic science and technology will continue to solve more cold cases from the 1990s